Hello, in this video I'm going to look at how you can use a reasonably new technology called GitHub Codespaces for helping to make contributions to the Chocolatey documentation site. So in the last couple of videos we spoke through how you could make smaller changes to the Chocolatey docs directly through the GitHub user interface, or using the GitHub.dev environment, as well as cloning the entire repository locally so that you can preview the site on your own machine before submitting changes back to the repository. Now, all of those are perfectly valid ways of doing things. The first couple are kind of really more about making smaller changes where you don't need to preview the site in order to see the changes you've made. The last one, cloning locally and running locally, gives you the benefit of seeing the changes on your machine, but it does involve a little bit more setup because you have to install things like the .NET SDK, Node, and Yarn in order to preview the site locally on your machine. Now, the final one I want to talk about is GitHub Codespaces. Now, it's kind of the best of both worlds. It gives you the ability to make more involved changes to the site, but without needing to spin up or downloading and installing a bunch of prerequisite packages in order to make the preview work. Now, before we dig into Codespaces, I'll just reiterate again, if you are looking to make changes to the Chocolatey documentation website, I would encourage you to first create an issue. If it's a bigger change that you're looking to make, I would encourage you to create an issue, get some buy-in from the team, make sure that the contribution that you're looking to make makes sense. We might have suggestions on how things can be done in a way that to better get changes merged in. So I would encourage you to do that rather than doing a lot of changes, which then might have to be pushed back on. We might not be able to accept the changes. If you first get some buy-in from the team, then make the changes, then it's a better experience all round, because we don't feel guilty about not being able to accept something, and then you haven't done a lot of work, then ultimately can't get merged in. So the way that I'm going to talk about GitHub Codespaces, or explain what GitHub Codespaces is just to show it. Now, not everyone has access to GitHub Codespaces currently, but they're pretty cool. So when they do go GA from GitHub, I would encourage you to take a look at them and see if they will be useful for you. But from this repository, and this is the slight difference to the previous videos, I've been signed in as my alter ego of Gep31 so that I can show you the process of creating a fork, making a branch, and submitting the PR into the repository. But in this scenario, I'm logged in back in as me now, as Gep13, because I've been added into the preview of GitHub Codespaces and I can show you how that works now. So up here under code, you would typically have the information here, which is to clone the repository or open in GitHub Desktop, etc. But once activated, you've now got this new tab here, which is GitHub Codespaces. So what I can do is I'm going to click on New Codespace here, and what's going to happen is it's going to go off and it's going to take that repository, my clone of that repository, or it's going to clone that repository, and it's going to create me an environment where all of that code is cloned out into the running machine in the cloud, and it's going to open up Visual Studio Code in the browser with all of my extensions installed, the things set up the way that I want them to. So it's the same experience that I would have as though I was developing locally on my own machine. The difference between this though, and so if I go over here and I click or I press the period or the full stop button on when I'm in the repository, the difference between what you would see here and what you would see, or what you see in GitHub Codespaces, is that this one doesn't have the concept of a terminal. So if I try and view terminal here, it says it doesn't have that. So it says terminals are not available in the web editor. But over here in GitHub Codespaces, I do have access to a terminal, which means that I can do other stuff. And that other stuff is the preview that I showed you running when I clone the repository locally on my machine. Because if I do an ls here, I can see that all of the files are there, including one of those, which is the preview.ps1. That's the one that I ran locally on my machine, my Windows machine. But in this one, I'm now going to run the preview.sh because I'm now running on a container that is POSIX based. So I'm not using the PowerShell script anymore. I'm going to use the preview.sh now. And what this is going to do is this is going to run this that script. It's going to do the exact same thing as it did before when I ran it locally on my machine. It's going to run yarn install to make sure that all the client-side dependencies are available on the machine. It's going to run the gulp task, which is to then take my JavaScript assets, my CSS assets, compile them all down into the way that I need them to. It's then going to run static against that input folder with all those markdown files. It's going to take them, it's going to create the HTML assets from that build, and then it's going to run a preview server in the cloud. Now, the benefit of that is that I can get the benefit of making all the documentation changes that I want to. I can make changes as I need them to, but then I can also see the changes in the browser before I submit a PR. Now, that benefit, that's the concrete benefit, but I haven't had to install any packages locally on my machine. I haven't had to set up my environment. Everything is in the cloud, in the container, configured and set up the way it needs to be in order for it to run. What's going to happen once this process finishes is there's going to be a little pop-up appear, and because it's going to identify that something established a web server running locally on that container. And what it's going to do is it's going to punch a hole from my browser here through to that web server so I can see what it's rendering, right? Now, the step, I mean, the step that's happening here is it takes a little while the first time round because the first time static runs, it's generating lots and lots of files. But static does a really good job of caching those files on subsequent executions. So first time round, it takes a little bit of time. Second time round, it doesn't take as much time, but the result is the same. I can still preview the site, I can see all the changes, and I can make those contributions as though I tested it all locally on my machine, but without having to do all the work of installing all of those packages on my machine. So we'll just wait for this to finish. And once it does, I will then open up another tab. So that's to get into the final part, which is the analyzing. So I mentioned this in the previous video, but the last thing that static does as part of its execution is it runs a series of analyzers to make sure that we haven't created an invalid cross-link between one page and another, and a couple other things. So what it's done is it's popped up the, I'm going to click this before I talk about it some more, before it disappears. I'm going to click on open in browser, because what it did, and let's just flip back to it. So what it did is it's saying preview server listing at localhost 5080. Now, obviously that's localhost on the container that's running in the cloud. But what it's done is it's punched a hole through that server running on localhost port 5080. And that's now available to me here at this URL. And at this point, this is the fully running version that I've just built through GitHub Codespaces. So if I wanted to make a change, so the change that I made in the previous version when I was running locally, in the previous video where I was running locally, was I went into the index.md file at the root, and I just changed this to, I changed this word here from Chocolatey to Gary. So this time round, I'm going to change this to Bob, just so I'm doing something different, and I'm going to hit save. So this is then going to kick off the static process again, running in the container, in the cloud. And then what should happen is that this page will be automatically updated. Now, that's the one difference between running it through GitHub Codespaces and running it through the preview server running locally on your machine. That automatic updating of the site or the page that you're looking at doesn't happen. It's unfortunate, but I can also completely understand why, because the way that kind of interaction works between the preview server and the site is there's a kind of a connection there. It knows when the preview server has done something to the point that it needs to be updated. Because of that hole that's been punched between my machine and the running container, that connection can't happen. So although static is now saying it's finished, if I go back over here, then we won't see it automatically update. But if I go and hit refresh here, then it does have Bob there. So it's a slight annoyance, but I can also completely understand why it doesn't work. But at this point, just to reiterate, I've got in the browser, I've got a fully running version of the website running the code that I've just changed. So I can know from my browser the changes that I make. I can see them live, and then I can submit a PR into the repository for getting merged into the repository. So I'm going to exit out of this, because what I also wanted to show was the other benefit then is if I do this, what I should hopefully be able to show is I'm going to spin the same thing up on my iPad. So when it pops up, so this is my iPad, open it at the same repository. So if I go here and let's go to the Chocolatey docs repository, the one that I was at. I'm going to click code here. That's my code space that I just created. So I'm going to switch to that code space in my browser running on the iPad, and I can do the exact same thing that I was doing on my machine through Google Chrome in the browser on the iPad. So I'm going to try and make this screen, and this is the other benefit. This is me playing with a technology that wouldn't know how to run on the iPad directly. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to type preview.sh in the exact same way that I did before. And then the exact same thing is going to happen. It's going to run static. It's going to run yarn. It's going to run gulp. All of those assets are going to be compiled. It's then going to ask to punch a hole in the from the running instance of the container in the cloud through to the iPad. So I've got the ability then to do everything that I just spoke about, make changes to the site, preview them in the browser before submitting to them from an iPad. And that to me is kind of mind-boggling. But we'll just wait for this to finish. And then what it should do, it should pop up that same prompt to say open in the browser. And at this point, because the code space is the same, it's the running instance of that code space is the same, I've already got that local change that I made to the index.md file. That file's already been changed and it's already there, ready to be previewed. So when this pops up, I should get the exact same output as I did before. But to me, this is mind-boggling, and it's really the selling point for Codespaces is that what you're paying for, or what you'll ultimately end up paying for, because it's not going to be a free offering from GitHub. Codespaces will have a cost associated with it. But now I open in the browser, I get a new tab open on the iPad, and then this is the running instance of the doc site with my modification on it saying, what is Bob? Preview it, I make sure that it's all working the way I want it to, then I submit the PR, someone on the team will pick it up and review it, and at that point, your contribution into the documentation site is complete. So there's a lot to be said for Codespaces. I would encourage you to go and check it out, and if you haven't already, sign up to enroll in the beta that's available for it. Have a play with it and see what you think of it. But for now, that's the documentation. This is the last in the series of videos about how you can contribute to the documentation for Chocolatey. Just to reiterate again, if you are making changes, like a substantial change to the documentation, please create an issue so that we can discuss it first. Once you get buy-in, then make the change either through the GitHub user interface, using github.dev, or by running it locally on your machine, or by using something like GitHub Codespaces. Make the change, submit it as a PR, we'll review it, and then we'll get it merged in and live on the site. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. I hope this has been useful.